Russia is losing in Ukraine, and we don't just mean the war. Russia is losing itself. As over 1,000 soldiers die every single day, shocking statistics are now being exposed that show us two things. Putin's army is bleeding out, and Russia itself won't recover for 100 years after Ukraine is over. Putin's folly has been exposed as his soldiers die in numbers nobody ever expected. For Russia, the future looks far bleaker now than it ever did before Putin invaded. It all starts with the sharp rise in casualties that Russia has been experiencing in recent months. According to the Financial Times, both Ukrainian and European officials say that more of Russia's soldiers are being killed or are going missing in action than ever before, which has the knock-on effect of making every Russian offensive that follows weaker than the one that came before. Over the long term, Russia is putting itself in a position where the entire country will be on the verge of collapse over the next few decades. But we'll get to that. First, let's look at the numbers to see if they are as bad as the Financial Times claims. Spoiler, they are. In February, the Ukrainian military's commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrskyi, revealed two things. One, Russia had lost 31,700 of its soldiers in January alone. And two, Russian recruitment levels are nowhere near as high enough to replace that meat that Putin had fed into the grinder. These losses add to those experienced already during a 4-year war that has cost Russia over 1.2 million soldiers. In 2025 alone, United 24 Media says, Russia is estimated to have lost 415,000 soldiers, which amounts to an average of 35,000 casualties per month. It looks like Ukraine slowed down in January, but nothing could be further from the truth. The 415,000 soldiers figure relates to casualties, which include deaths, injuries, captures, and desertions. As for the 31,700 Russians eliminated in January, these are supposedly all deaths. Ukraine's drones were busy during the first month of the year, and every single one of these losses has been filmed by the drones that caused them, with that footage all being uploaded to Ukraine's Delta system, which enables verification. You don't need to be a maths whiz to see that 31,700 soldiers dead in January amounts to more than 1,000 losses per day. 1,022.6 if we're being precise. We throw in the 35,000 casualties per month seen in 2025, and the number, including other types of losses, is likely over 1,160. The other remarkable thing that Syrskyi mentions is that Russia's loss rate is now so high that it's losing soldiers faster than it's able to replace them. January saw Russia deal with a 9,000 soldier shortfall on the recruiting front, which means that Ukraine has turned a major corner. It's going to keep on doing what it's doing, only now what previously seemed like a limitless supply of Russian manpower is starting to wane. Each time Ukraine eliminates more than Russia recruits, Putin's overall invading force is weakened substantially. So is Russia as a whole. You'll soon see why. Why doesn't Russia just recruit more soldiers then, you may ask? It's a logical question. The Kremlin has shown many times that it's willing to splash its cash to hire more cannon fodder for Putin's war. However, that approach is starting to fail, as many of those who were desperate enough to take that money have already been churned up, leaving Russia with a decreasing pool of potential soldiers to hire from. Not enough Russians are being induced to fight in Ukraine by the enormous payouts on offer, forcing Moscow's army to recruit a higher share of accused criminals, pressure conscripts into signing contracts once their mandatory service ends, and redeploy wounded soldiers. The Financial Times reported on February 10th. And if Russia had been paying attention, it would have known that a recruitment crisis was looming. In 2025, Russia's new military recruitment figures had already dipped, the Moscow Times said in January. Not by much. Russia itself set a goal of 422,000 new soldiers, according to Putin's favorite mouthpiece, and it claims to have exceeded that goal by 704 people. But the quote was far lower than the 450,000 Medvedev claimed that Russia recruited in 2024, and hitting 422,000 was a result of Russian recruiters being forced into overdrive to pull the dregs that are now filling the battlefield in Ukraine. Adding to all of the deaths that Ukraine's drones are causing is a record-breaking desertion rate among Russia's soldiers. According to United 24 Media, 70,000 of Russia's soldiers were expected to abandon their units by the end of 2025. A little bit of math shows us that this is about a sixth of the total that Russia recruited for the year, and that is yet another problem Putin faces. The Financial Times says that desertion rates in Russia are now at their highest point during the war, suggesting that the non-combatants and desperate people that Putin is press-ganging into the Russian military are waking up to the fact that big payouts don't mean much when you have an entire body full of drone shrapnel. Speaking of desperate people, that phrase pretty accurately describes the Putin cronies running around the Kremlin right now. They know that they have to keep the recruitment numbers up hook or by crook, Their glorious leader demands it, and they all know that there are a lot of windows in Moscow out of which they could end up taking an unfortunate tumble if they don't give Putin what they want. So what we're now seeing in Russia is an increasingly frantic attempt to recruit people, and by people we mean literally anybody who is still willing to take the big payday that Russia offers. The Financial Times already touched on this with its mentions of the criminals and the wounded. With over 1,000 of its soldiers dying daily, Russia's attempts to recruit are getting ever more drastic. ABC said back in January that Russia is freeing as many of its prisoners as it can, as long as those prisoners are happy to pick up a rifle and do their time in Ukraine to get out of serving sentences in the Russian jails. By January 2025, Russia had recruited 180,000 of its soldiers from its own penal system per the Kyiv Independent, and the likelihood is that this number has easily rocketed past 200,000 in the year or so since. That seems like a good idea. Send people who are convicted murderers, rapists, and drug dealers into Ukraine, and you surely have the basis of a strong army, right? Sarcasm aside, even the prison system can't keep feeding Russia's recruitment treadmill forever. To overcome that, Russia is also turning to foreign fighters from anywhere that it can get them. ABC reports that an independent examination of Russian troop death revealed that over 550 of the 160,000 soldiers examined were foreigners from many different countries, showcasing that Russia is getting desperate enough to spend its money outside of its own territory just to keep the flow of soldiers coming in. Other recruitment efforts are more drastic, as ERR News reported the Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service is stating on February 10th. Volunteer numbers are dwindling, the service claims, which has led to Russia to subject those who can't be lured by payouts to intense pressure that includes deception, intimidation, psychological manipulation, and in some cases, brute physical force, all to get people who want to be as far away from Ukraine as possible to the front lines. Russia is now targeting socially vulnerable groups to pump up its numbers, including the chronically unemployed, those struggling with addictions, and people being suffocated by mounds of debt. Consequently, Russia's frontline units are largely composed of individuals who, under normal circumstances, should not be trusted with weapons, Estonia's Foreign Intelligence Service claims. Again, sounds like the foundation for a strong army, right? People who don't want to fight are being forced into a battle where their lives are over in a heartbeat due to Russia's rubbish tactics and Ukraine's strong defense of its territory. And make no mistake about it, the Kremlin knows how useless these supposed fighters are. It's not even bothering to properly train the cannon fodder that it's pulling into its military, as United 24 media revealed on February 10th. Russian military training lasts for less than 2 weeks, as Ivan, who is a Russian recruit who spoke to the outlet, revealed. After all the medical checkups, they asked me if I was ready to go to the military base the day after tomorrow. They trained us for 5 days. We waited for another 5 days for a force rotation, and then we went to combat positions, Ivan reveals. It's no wonder that Russia is losing over 1,000 soldiers per day now. The country's military training lasted up to 6 months before it was cut to 3 months in 2013. Russia's own laws state that its conscripts are supposed to undergo 4 months of training before they're deployed, which clearly isn't happening. Now Russia is training its soldiers for about as long as it takes to make a decent sourdough starter, and those soldiers are lasting about as long in Ukraine as that lump of bread would. The veterans are gone. Almost anybody who actually wants to fight is gone. All that's left is the cannon fodder that Putin keeps on throwing against Ukraine's drones. By now you're starting to see why Russia's military is failing so badly to make any sort of notable progress in Ukraine. But back at the start of the video, we told you that the war that Putin started is one from which Russia won't recover for 100 years. Why is that? Well, to answer that question, we need to go all the way back to the start of Putin's time as Russia's president. The former KGB agent was, well, not fresh-faced and doe-eyed, but perhaps not quite as aware of the demographic and population storms into which he was walking than he needed to be. As The Independent put it in October 2025, Putin has spent much of his time as president grappling with Russia's population problem when he isn't trying to wage war. He acknowledged the issue as far back as 2005 when he said that doing something about Russia's population problem was vital for the social and economic stability of Russia. He said something similar in 2019, noting that Russia was haunted by a population problem that Putin still hasn't solved. And in the same month that The Independent published its article, Putin had been banging the population drum again by emphasizing how raising Russia's birth rate was essential to the entire future of the country. Of course, he said all of this while about 1,000 potential fathers were dying in Ukraine daily. But Putin was never one to let his own poor decisions get in the way of good proclamation. None of the initiatives that Putin has implemented since coming to power has helped in the long term. The period of economic prosperity that Russia enjoyed during the early years of Putin's reign helped, sure. The country's birth rate climbed from 1.21 million children per year in 1999 to 1.94 million in 2015, but it's plummeted again, declining annually since the peak. 2024 brought with it just 1.22 million births, placing Russia right back where it started when Putin came to power. And the country's population has been on a slow and steady decline since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1990, Russia had a population of 147.6 million. Now it's 146.1 million, and that's including the 2 million that Russia counts from its illegal annexation of Crimea. But what does this have to do with Russia not recovering for a century? Let's fast forward to 2100, a little over 100 years after Putin took power. Russia is being impacted more by a general global trend of people having fewer children than many other nations. According to the Institute for Human Sciences, the United Nations is anticipating that Russia's population will have dropped to between 74 million and 112 million from what it is now. In the world of tomorrow, Russia will be a territorial giant and a population dwarf. That is what Putin understands. Russia's population will not only be much smaller than that of China, India, or the United States, but also half that of Brazil and Ethiopia, and 1/3 that of Nigeria and Pakistan, the Institute says. This is a problem that is a century in the making for Russia, and the country is a quarter of a way to getting there. Now let's add a brutal and attritional war to this natural crisis, a war that has cost Russia over 1.22 million of its own people, almost all men, already. A war that is still costing over 1,000 per day. A war that former Forbes contributor David Axe says could take Russia up until 2256 to win, at the cost of 101 million souls if advances continue at the rate seen back in May 2025. What impact do you think that enormous loss of potential fathers will have on Russia in 100 years? It's far from a good impact on the population front, and Russia's declining population feeds into a lot of other issues that look set to wreck the country long after Putin breathes his final breath. As the Carnegie Endowment points out, Russia went through something pretty similar on the birth rate front during the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, the problems caused by low birth rates were mitigated by influxes of Russian-speaking citizens of the former Soviet republics that moved to the motherland from their former homes. Russia no longer has that get-out-of-jail-free card. Sure, people still immigrate to the country, but they aren't Russian speakers, and those potential immigrants now have more options. The endowment points to laborers from Central Asia who once moved to Russia in massive numbers. There are now between 3 and 3.5 million of this particular demographic in Russia, when there was about double that number between 2012 and 13. Russia is in a catch-22 here as well. More immigrants from Asian territories results in the Russian sense of identity being chipped away. But when immigrants from other countries are leaving, as they've done in their millions over the past decade or so, Russia loses its labor, which causes massive economic problems. Russia was already running out of the people it needs to work at home. Losing over 1,000 soldiers a day in Ukraine only accelerates that process, feeding into a population crisis that has been a century in the making. We're already seeing an impact on Russia's economy that is directly caused by Putin's invasion. Speaking to Forbes in October, the Associate Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, Andrew Danieri, said, "Russian men in their 30s are by far the largest casualty demographic on the Russian side. These are men who would soon be entering their prime salary-earning years. Instead, the volunteer soldiers, known as kontraktniki, have chosen the huge initial payouts offered by the government for fighting and dying in Ukraine. It's the dying part that matters. Every dead 30-something is a Russian who can't start a family, or one who leaves a family behind. It all feeds into the massive population crisis that Russia already has, and things are only going to get much, much worse for Russia over the next 75 years or so. Russia has already burned through its skilled soldiers. Most of what the country sends into Ukraine is cannon fodder now. Some of those that Russia has lost and continues to lose had other skills. Some may have been engineers who could have helped Russia to develop its infrastructure. Others may have been semi-skilled laborers that Russia needs for factories that are only operating at 81% now, and will continue to see declines as more of the talent pool and the money dries up. Putin's war isn't just killing over 1,000 soldiers per day, it's killing workers, it's killing husbands, fathers, career men, moneymakers, mines, and everything else that a country needs to thrive well into the future. Sure, Russia as an entity will survive the next century, probably, but it will do so having watched emerging global powers like China and India fly right past it, all for the sake of Putin's territorializing fantasies. It all comes down to a simple question: who is going to rebuild in Russia? It isn't going to be the people that Putin is sacrificing for his own misguided ambitions. They won't be working, having kids, or doing anything that could save Russia from the fate that seems inevitable by 2100. It won't even be Putin, Russia's president, who is 73, and unless he intends for Russia to use an ever-rotating cast of body doubles to feign immortality, he isn't going to be around all that much longer. Let's bring things back to the battlefield. The reality is that the sheer scale of Russian deaths we're seeing now isn't going to get any better. Ukraine's defense ministry has set a target of 50,000 Russian soldiers killed per month, which will only exacerbate a recruitment crisis that is born from Russia no longer having as many people who are willing to fight for the Putin paycheck. Every one of those deaths will also contribute to Russia's population problem in the ways we've just described. Ukraine stands a good chance of hitting this target if what we see now on the battlefield is any indication. Russian offensives are already weakening. At its current pace, it will take Russia at least 2 more years to fully occupy the Donbas region for which it's fighting right now, per the Deep State UA monitoring project. That's 2 more years of constant death that, at a rough estimate based on what Russia has lost so far, will cost the country another 600,000 or so people. Probably more, given that Russia's large mechanized assaults are mostly a thing of the past. Russia ran out of armor before it ran out of people. It's using dismounted infantry to make minor gains, with infiltration tactics that often result in yet more death now being the norm. When the so-called special military operation failed, Putin made a bet. If Russia applied enough pressure, Ukraine would crumble. That bet is now lost, says Michael Kaufman of the Carnegie Endowment. Putin's bet has been that sustained pressure across the board is going to eventually lead to a collapse on the Ukrainian side. But the way Russian forces are fighting simply won't generate operationally significant breakthroughs, Kaufman says. All we can ask now is how long will Putin keep all of this up? The longer the Ukraine war goes on, the worse Russia is going to look by the end of the century. If Putin keeps chasing after the failed bet, Russia might even get to its anticipated population a lot faster, spelling doom for its economy, its military, and its people. Putin's army is bleeding out. Russia itself is doing the same. Putin wanted an empire, and he's created a collapse. Economic strain, increasing desires for separatism, and vanishing geopolitical influence are all also contributing to the fall of Russia.
On and on it goes. Kremlin orders the assaults, and Russia's soldiers march. Bereft of armor and in terrible condition, those soldiers attempt to make it across kill zones filled with drones to fight against Ukrainians who are waiting to destroy them. The inevitable is happening. Russia's soldiers are dying in record numbers. Vladimir Putin's troops are being erased as a drone storm descends to cause Russia the worst military losses in modern history. January has been a month of constant death for Russia, and it's Ukraine's drones that are once again at the heart of the action. On February 5th, Ukraine announced that it had eliminated over 30,000 Russian soldiers in January alone. And when we say eliminated, we mean that those soldiers are never coming back. They haven't been injured, they haven't been captured. These are all soldiers who have been obliterated by Ukraine's drones, with each of the deaths being verified, as President Volodymyr Zelensky explains. All losses are verified. Every strike has video confirmation in the Delta system, Zelensky said when revealing the numbers. We'll come back to that interesting system in a moment. First, Ukraine's new defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov also had plenty to say about what the country's unmanned systems forces achieved in January. Taking to Telegram to publicize the latest figures, Fedorov said, "In January, the defense forces eliminated over 30,000 Russian troops. All losses were verified. Each strike has video confirmation in the Delta system. The leader in this direction, according to the results of this month, was the SBU Special Unit Alpha." That last part is particularly interesting. By this point, it's well known that Ukraine has developed leaderboards for its drone operators, which it uses to both keep track of their accomplishments and reward those who destroy Russian soldiers. It looks like the Alpha unit of the Security Service of Ukraine, or SBU, scored the highest number of kills this month. Perhaps next month, it'll be a different unit. Fedorov also provided a bit more clarity on the figures in a graphic he shared in his Telegram post. The precise number of Russian soldiers that Ukraine verifiably killed in January was 30,618. which amounts to about 987 Russian troops dead every single day. Operationally, this has a massive effect on Russia, as it's burning through soldiers at such a rate that its offensives are naturally being limited in their strength and number. It also appears that Ukraine's drone operators took part in 7,495 of what Fedorov calls NRC missions during the month. According to Pravda, NRC missions amount to missions carried out by Ukraine's ground robots. Fedorov highlighted Ukraine's 3rd Separate Assault Brigade as the standout unit in this department, and noted that Ukraine's ultimate goal is for robots to perform as much dangerous work on the battlefield as possible, reducing the risk for our soldiers. But the specifics don't matter as much as the headline numbers. For Putin, January is a month when Russia lost well over 30,000 soldiers, including the soldiers that Russia's leader barely sees as human. There's a lot more to cover, so stay with us until later in the video to discover what else Ukraine achieved in January. We mentioned Ukraine's Delta system earlier. The system is what the country uses to track the number of kills that its drone operators achieve, and it's a remarkable piece of technology. Back in August, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, or MOD, announced that the Delta system had been deployed across all levels of the Ukrainian military, which essentially means that every unit now has access to the treasure trove of data and information the system contains. And treasure trove is the perfect term. The technical description that the MOD provides for Delta is useful, though it doesn't really explain how powerful the system is. Former Defense Minister Denis Shmyhal says, "Delta is a combat digital ecosystem that gives the Ukrainian armed forces a technological edge. It enables real-time battlefield awareness, supports operational planning, and facilitates information sharing with units, brigades, formations, and when needed, with allies." So it's clearly an intelligence tool. However, its sheer scope is unrivaled by almost anything in the world. We'll give you an example. Each of the drone kills that Ukraine claimed in January has been recorded by the very FPV drones that made those kills. All of that footage is uploaded to Delta for everybody to see, which is valuable intelligence in its own right. Every drone kill has the potential to reveal even more information, such as the locations of equipment that Russia's soldiers are trying to move around Ukraine. Now add reconnaissance drones to that mix. Every drone that Ukraine has scouting the ground from the skies is uploading footage captured in real time to Delta. Those monitoring the system can order rapid attacks on whatever Ukraine's reconnaissance drones see, and the information is being shared across the entire Ukrainian military. There's a lot more, of course, but even back in August, Shmyhal claimed that Delta supported the targeting of 2,000 Russian assets per day, which amounts to around 730,000 verified targets annually. Delta may just be the single most important system that Ukraine has at its disposal. We focused on footage collected by drones, but as Gray Dynamics reveals, images and videos captured by human intelligence sources, sensors, satellites, and essentially anything that is capable of transmitting information to a digital system are all sent to Delta. The result of all this information, in simple terms, is a massive, illustrated map that reveals the locations of Russian forces, with that map being key to every decision that Ukraine makes on the ground and in the air. This is network-centric warfare, and in less than 4 years, Ukraine has become a master of it. It's thanks to Delta that Ukraine knows exactly how many Russian soldiers it killed in January. And it's also Delta that allows us to see that the January kill count comes on the back of several months where Ukraine has been inflicting insane casualties against the Russian invaders. In December, for instance, Zelensky claimed that Ukraine had killed 35,000 Russian soldiers for that month. That was double the number of Russian soldiers killed in December of 2024, though it isn't clear if all of these kills were achieved by drones or if they're verified kills from every possible source. United 24 Media adds that the kill count for November was around 26,000, with October delivering almost 25,000 kills, all verified via Delta. What we saw in January is far from a one-off. It's the new pattern of the Ukraine war, and there are a lot of reasons why Ukraine scoring such massive kill counts month after month is bad for Russia. You're going to learn all about those reasons soon, but before you do, we have a very important point to make. The kills that Ukraine reported for January are only those that it has verified via Delta. There will be a lot more. Delta doesn't have evidence of every kill that Ukraine achieved. It can only prove the kills that are recorded and uploaded to the system. So let's say that Ukrainian artillery fire obliterates a Russian foxhole. Such an attack could kill several of Putin's occupiers, but those deaths wouldn't be verified unless the aftermath was recorded or photographed. That's difficult to do when the bodies are in trenches or hunkered down in bunkers, and Ukraine has more important things to do than waste drones on checking out every destroyed site. It's enough to know that the site has been obliterated. In such cases, the deaths aren't counted. Examples of strikes against Russia that aren't recorded take place every day. That means we can likely add several thousand more deaths to the figure that Ukraine has revealed, turning an already terrible month for Putin into one that could indicate that a true shift has taken place in the war. And as though things couldn't get any worse for Russia, Ukraine has also revealed that it isn't going to rest on its laurels. 30,000 verified kills in a single month are impressive, but what about 50,000? That's the monthly target that Fedorov has set for Ukraine's drones in 2026, in a move that is designed to make the cost of the war, both in terms of money and manpower, unsustainable for Russia. So we might be reporting on more record-breaking months in 2026, assuming the war drags on for the rest of the year. And there's more. Ukraine's FPV drone operators have grabbed all of the headlines in January, but its defensive operators have been crucial too. We'll let Fedorov explain. Operators of interceptor drones shot down a record number of Shahids, with Nemesis emerging as the leader, Ukraine's defense minister said on Telegram, adding, "We are actively increasing the effectiveness of small air defense systems to protect the sky. At the same time, together with our partners, we are cutting off the enemy's ability to use Western technologies to attack Ukrainians." Fedorov doesn't provide any figures outside of noting the record-breaking achievements of Ukraine's interceptor drone operators. But those drone operators need to be breaking records. According to UKR-Inform, Russia unleashed more than 6,000 long-range attack drones, likely Shahid drones and variants of the Shahid design, in January 2026. That is an enormous number of drones sent to overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses. The more attack drones that Ukraine's interceptors can destroy, the better for its other air defense systems, which can focus on taking out the missiles and guided bombs that Russia typically launches alongside its drones. None of this is good for Russia, but before we go deeper into that, you're watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time if you want more insight into Ukraine's defense against Putin's aggression. Now, we've mentioned a few times that what Ukraine achieved in January will have several ramifications on the battlefield. Chief among those impacts is simple: Ukraine is maintaining its high tempo of Russian kills. You've seen that already, as we've highlighted how this is the second month in a row that Ukraine's drones scored 30,000 kills or more, and the fourth month that has seen Ukraine hit or top that approximate 25,000 mark. What we're seeing here is the result of years of Ukraine's focus on innovating in the drone space manifesting into a new type of strategy that's never been seen before. Russia's soldiers wouldn't be dying in such massive numbers if Ukraine had restricted itself to fighting the type of war that Putin wanted to fight. If all Ukraine did was fortify and fight against the masses of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, and soldiers that Russia deploys, Putin's forces would have advanced much more quickly across Ukraine. But the soldiers are barely advancing, and the reason is that tens of thousands of them are being shredded to pieces long before they make it to the positions that they're supposed to be attacking. Ukraine has created deep kill zones that are filled with FPV drones and other defenses, all of which lie ahead of the fortifications that Russia needs to topple. As Politico said in November, the result has been the creation of a grey zone of horror where drones are constantly on the hunt for targets. This grey zone often extends up to 20 kilometers or about 12.4 miles from the front. Neither side wants its soldiers in the grey zone, and Ukraine doesn't have to send any. It's Russia that is launching these assaults, which means that it's Russia that is sending soldiers in their thousands to cross what has become the modern-day equivalent of the no-man's land seen during the trench warfare of World War I. Ukraine's defense of its cities is now heavily reliant on these kill zones, and they're proving how effective they can be. Russia is forced to expend enormous numbers of soldiers and pieces of equipment to get across, all while Ukraine's defenders stay back and let the meat send itself into the grinder. When Russia's forces do break through, they are utterly spent. As for Ukraine, the attrition that it inflicts on Russia's attacking forces creates gaps in the kill zones, through which targeted counter-assaults can be launched. Ukraine doesn't have to send soldiers in their thousands. Once the kill zones and the thousands of drones flying in them have done their work, Ukraine can push back. February 5th also brought with it another interesting revelation. According to NBC News, Zelensky has acknowledged that 55,000 of Ukraine's soldiers have died in the fight against Russia. This is a tragedy for Ukraine, but it also casts an even harsher spotlight on just how effectively Ukraine has defended its territory against Russian aggression. 55,000 is less than the number of deaths that Ukraine has inflicted on Russia's forces in December and January, which combined for a total of 65,000 deaths. In other words, Russia has lost more of its soldiers in 2 months than Ukraine has lost in almost 4 years of fighting. We have a little more insight into these numbers. In February 2025, Zelensky claimed that 46,000 of Ukraine's soldiers have been killed. So, the past year has seen Ukraine lose just 9,000 soldiers, for a death rate of 750 per month. Russia lost 40 times that amount in January alone, which is a shocking statistic that reveals two things. Russia's strategy isn't working, and Ukraine is successfully leveraging its drones to both inflict massive casualties and preserve the lives of its own soldiers. Again, we come back to the point about how Ukraine has completely changed the rules of warfare from what Putin thought them to be. No amount of defenses seems to be helping Russia. Netting and signal interference can be used in the occupied territories to potentially stop Ukraine's drones from doing their damage, but in the kill zones, Russia's soldiers are on their own. Quite literally in some cases, as Russia is sending its infantry to assault Ukraine's defenses in units containing as few as 4 to 6 soldiers. It doesn't take much for those units to break apart as they traverse the kill zones, leading to panicked Russian soldiers running around like headless chickens until the inevitable happens. A drone finds them. Delta gets a new video. The only thing that could set Ukraine's kill zone strategy back is running out of drones, which would force its soldiers to take an even more active role in defending Ukraine's cities than they already are. However, any hope Putin had of that happening has already been vanquished. On January 26th, Militani reported that Ukraine plans to produce more than 7 million drones of various types in 2026. That number was revealed by Ukraine's Deputy Minister of Defense Serhiy Boyev. He added that Ukraine's drones have made it possible to create what he calls strike zones, which are the 20-kilometer kill zones. And as it scales up its drone production, Ukraine plans on expanding these kill zones to 100 kilometers, or about 62 miles, which will be achieved by striking Russian targets at operational depth, in addition to taking out soldiers and equipment that's trying to get into assault range against Ukraine's defenses. This is yet more evolution. Ukraine will be using middle strike drones to attack logistic nodes, command centers, and troop gatherings behind the combat lines, as its FPV drones make life hell for soldiers who are actually on those lines. And all the while, Delta will be feeding information to Ukraine's soldiers who are increasingly able to use drones to do work that would have previously placed them at enormous risk. In 2026, we're starting to see Ukraine do something that United 24 media calls bending the curve. Up until this point, Russia has not only been able to replace its lost soldiers, but it's recruited so many that it's multiplied the size of its force in Ukraine several times over. The 50,000 deaths target that Fedorov set is key to overcoming Russia's manpower, as United 24 media explains. This is critical for the war in Ukraine. Over 4 years of fighting, Moscow has sent an entire army into the war and lost it, 1.2 million people, and recruited the same number again. Having launched its full-scale invasion with 160,000 troops, the Russian grouping on Ukrainian territory has since surpassed 700,000 soldiers, the outlet says. Bending the curve means reversing the trend of Russia being able to replace lost soldiers and build upon its existing force. In other words, Ukraine's goal is now to inflict so many deaths on Russia each month that Putin's recruiters simply aren't able to keep up. If Ukraine can get to that point, 700,000 soldiers would soon become 650, then 600,000, and so on, leading to the one advantage that Russia still has over Ukraine evaporating into nothingness. The last couple of months have been big for Ukraine because it saw the curve bend. According to the Kyiv Independent, Russia only managed to recruit 27,400 new contract soldiers in December. You may remember that Ukraine killed about 35,000 of Putin's troops during that month, which means that Russia had a 7,600 soldier shortfall in December. We don't yet know if Russia's recruiting efforts were more successful in January than they were the previous month. But even if they were, Russia has a target of 400,000 new recruits in 2026, which amounts to about 33,300 per month. January could well have been another month where Russia's irrecoverable losses exceeded its recruiting, and there's no guarantee that the target that Russia has set for itself will actually be met. All of this adds up to more Russian soldiers dying in Ukraine than Russia can recruit. The curve is bending. If Ukraine can hit its 50,000 dead soldiers per month target, that bend will end up being a break that shatters any remaining hope that Putin has of defeating Ukraine. Ukraine has managed to turn a type of weapon that began life as an oddity into one of the most effective that modern warfare has ever seen. The Lazar group was crucial in making Ukraine's drones what they are, as that group has helped Ukraine to turn hunting Russians into a 24/7 McDonald's-like operation. The Russian steamroller was meant to run right over Ukraine, leaving Putin and his Kremlin cronies in a position to project power over an unready Europe. But that didn't happen. What was meant to be a flash invasion has just exposed Russia as the worst modern military of the past century. Putin's war in Ukraine is exploding as we speak, and we're all bearing witness to what a total military collapse looks like. And the evidence of that comes from a recent report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, which has pointed out that Russia's gains in Ukraine are so pathetic that the modern military world hasn't seen anything like it since World War I. Every war since has seen faster advances than Russia is achieving in Ukraine, and even some of the bloodiest battles of World War I resulted in a faster rate of advance than what Russia is achieving. As Putin's soldiers fight against waves of drones, battering artillery, and a Ukrainian defense that seems to have the ability to adapt to anything that Russia throws at it, one headline figure stands out. Russia advances at a rate of between 15 and 70 meters, or about 49.2 and 229.6 feet per day. You might travel about that far to reach the sidewalk from your own house, which shows us that Russia's forces are crawling rather than steamrolling their way to, well, not victory. Inevitable and devastating defeat seems more accurate. Russia is paying a massive price for these paltry gains, as you'll discover if you keep watching the video. However, before we delve into that, it's worth examining the CSIS report and its implications for the rate of Russia's advance in the territory it's actually capturing. The last 2 years in particular have been bleak for Russia on the advancement front. After the fall of Avdiivka in the Donetsk Oblast, which occurred in February 2024, Russia believed it had all the momentum and would sweep through Donetsk at will. All that stood in its way was the city of Pokrovsk, which had become established as Ukraine's key logistical and transportation hub in Donetsk, and across the entire eastern front. All Russia would have to do was attrit the target. Pokrovsk was battered almost from the moment that Avdiivka fell. Glide bombs flew into the city constantly, ravaging its buildings and destroying any hint of the impressive settlement it had once been. Russia deployed drones, both long-range and FPV, to draw its troops closer to Pokrovsk, and once those soldiers were within touching distance of the city, artillery shelling began alongside infantry assaults. It's the standard Russian tactic. Overwhelm an enemy with equipment and manpower, and Russia will win in the end. Only Russia hasn't won. As CSIS notes, Russia has only managed to advance just under 50 kilometers, or about 31 miles in the Pokrovsk direction, since the fall of Avdiivka and January 2026. That adds up to the glacial pace of 70 meters per day that we mentioned earlier, and it means that it's taken Russia almost 2 years to gain partial control over Pokrovsk. And we say partial because Ukraine is still defending the northern part of the city, so it could be many weeks or even months before Pokrovsk finally breaks, assuming it breaks at all. This Russian failure to capture key cities and settlements isn't limited to Pokrovsk. Take the settlement of Chasiv Yar, for instance. Much smaller than Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar is another of Ukraine's defensive nodes. Russia turned its sights onto the settlement in February 2024 after claiming Bakhmut the previous May, and it's even claimed to have captured the settlement as recently as July 2025. But Ukraine was still fighting when that claim was made, it's still fighting now, and Russia's rate of advance in the Chasiv Yar direction is even slower than in Pokrovsk. In its report on the CSIS article, United 24 Media says that Russian forces have advanced about 10 kilometers, or around 6.2 miles, in their 2 years of attempting to take Chasiv Yar. And that rate of advance gives us the lower end of the daily estimates that we highlighted as the headline figure earlier, just 15 meters per day. Everywhere you look across the portions of the combat lines where Russia is actively trying to advance as quickly as it can, you can see this kind of failure. In the Kupiansk sector, which is in Kharkiv, Russia has managed to push forward just 9.5 kilometers, or about 5.9 miles, since mid-November 2024, amounting to an average daily advance of just 23 meters, or a little over 75 feet. Russia has claimed that it captured Kupiansk, by the way. There's a reason why, as there was for the claimed capture of Chasiv Yar, that we'll reveal later in the video. The only bright spot for Russia is that it's managed to move quickly in its attempts to take the city of Huliapola, which is in the Zaporizhia Oblast. There, Russia's forces have managed to advance 18.5 kilometers, or around 11.5 miles, at a rate of 297 meters, or 974 feet per day. But after seeing what's happening elsewhere in Ukraine, Russia will have to be wondering how long it can keep that sort of pace up in the Huliapola sector before Ukraine starts mounting the kind of defense seen in the other 3 regions that we've mentioned. Now let's get to the really interesting numbers. How Russia's state of advance compares to what we've seen in other wars and battles over the past century. As we mentioned earlier, the ongoing Russian offensives, outside of that in the Huliapola sector, are achieving the rate of advance of just 15 to 70 meters per day, depending on the sector. That's worse than the rate seen during the grinding and terrible Battle of the Somme, which at least saw the combined UK and French troops advance 80 meters, or about 260 feet daily. That battle was one of the bloodiest during the entire First World War, to the point where the UK sustained 57,000 casualties in one day on July 1, 1916. Things haven't gotten that bad for Russia, but its crawling advance is officially worse than the ones seen in a battle where trench warfare ruled and soldiers died in droves trying to make it across no man's land. Russia itself advanced a lot faster following the siege of Leningrad during World War II, hitting a daily rate of about a kilometer, or 0.62 miles, CSIS claims. In the Battle of Galicia during World War I, Russia managed to hit a rate of advance of 1.58 kilometers, or a little under a mile per day. Again, these were grinding battles with enormous casualty rates, and Russia is moving far slower than the troops in any of them. But here's the kicker, a fresh batch of eggs to Putin's face. When Ukraine counter-invaded the Russian Oblast of Kursk, its soldiers managed to advance at a rate of 1.25 kilometers, or about 0.77 miles daily. That's faster than Russia has advanced across any major front in Ukraine, outside of the initial days of the invasion, when it took large swathes of territory in Kharkiv, Luhansk and Donetsk, among other regions. Ever since then, Russia has been crawling towards its target. A giant military turtle is as useless as the tanks that bear the same name, which are loaded with a mishmash of defenses in a desperate attempt to protect them from Ukraine's drones. Those turtle tanks rarely get anywhere, and it looks like the same can be said for Russia's advancing forces. Taking a wider view, CSIS reports that Russia has managed to fully seize around 75,000 square kilometers, or about 28,950 square miles of Ukraine, since Putin began his bloody invasion in February 2022. In terms of occupation and control, the number is a little higher.
120,000 square kilometers, or a little over 46,300 square miles, which is roughly 20% of Ukraine. However, this territory includes the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed in 2014, along with the small parts of the Donbass region that it occupied during that period. What seems like an impressive figure at first glance is made less so when you take the total amount of territory that Russia has captured over the last 2 years into account. In 2024, Russia occupied just 3,604 square kilometers, or 1,391 square miles of Ukraine. In 2025, the number was higher, at 4,831 square kilometers, or 1,865 square miles. But that was what Russia gained in return for a massive summer offensive that was supposed to put the finishing touches on a war that shows no signs of ending. We said earlier in the video that we are seeing what a military collapse looks like. These pathetic gains relative to the sheer size and supposed strength of Russia's military show that Putin's forces are utterly incapable of making any sort of real gains, and those they are making, as meager as they may be, are coming at a price that Russia can't afford to absorb for much longer. That price alone changes everything for Putin, but before we get to that, you are watching The Military Show, and now is the perfect time to subscribe to ensure that you don't miss videos like this in the future. Russia's slow rate of advance might be excusable if Putin were ordering his forces to hang back and only attack Ukraine when appropriate opportunities presented themselves. At least then, Russia would still be a turtle, but it might just be like the turtle in the famous fable, slow and steady wins the race, the theory would go. But you already know what we're going to say. There is nothing considered or careful about the strategy that Russia is employing in Ukraine. Russia has lost soldiers at a rate that nobody could have ever expected when Putin launched his invasion. CSIS estimates that Russia has lost 1.2 million soldiers to death, injury, capture, or simply going missing since February 2022. This is roughly in line with the estimates provided by Ukraine's own Ministry of Finance, which puts the number at roughly 1.236 million Russian soldiers. 2025 was a particularly damaging year for Russia, as CSIS reports that it lost 415,000 soldiers, creating a monthly casualty rate of 35,000. The picture might even be grimmer than that for Russia, especially after what Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky reported toward the end of the year. Zelensky said that Ukraine scored 35,000 eliminations, not casualties, of Russia's forces in December 2025. Add other casualties to that figure, and you get a monthly rate far larger than the CSIS estimate, and a rate that could easily see Russia's casualties top 500,000 in 2026, assuming Ukraine can keep up its defense. Well, let CSIS put this into context. No major power has suffered anywhere near these numbers of casualties or fatalities in any war since World War II, CSIS proclaims, adding, for example, US battlefield casualty and fatality numbers are significantly lower, with the United States suffering 54,487 battle deaths during the Korean War, 47,434 deaths during the Vietnam War, 149 deaths during the 1990-1991 Gulf War, 2,465 deaths in Afghanistan during Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Freedom Sentinel, and 4,432 deaths in Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Disregarding the success or otherwise of these campaigns, Russia is getting to a point where it could feasibly lose every month the same number of soldiers that the US lost during the entire Korean War. Putin's Ukraine track record doesn't compare favorably to Russia's military exploits since World War II either. Right now, CSIS's estimated Russian battlefield fatalities are between 275,000 and 325,000, are 11 times greater than those seen during both of the Chechen wars that occurred during the 1990s and 2000s, and 17 times greater than the former Soviet Union saw in Afghanistan during the 1980s. It's almost like Putin is trying to set some kind of record, and the award for slowest gains at the highest possible cost goes to Russia. Compounding all of this for Russia is that it's getting nowhere close to inflicting the types of casualties that Ukraine is inflicting on Putin's forces. That seems like an obvious statement to make, as a slow rate of advance naturally means that Russia can't be eliminating many Ukrainian soldiers. Still, the ratios make for interesting reading. According to CSIS, Ukraine has likely suffered between 500,000 and 600,000 casualties since February 2022, which is less than half of Russia's casualty count. These figures give us a ratio that is somewhere between 2 to 1 and 2.5 to 1 for Russian casualties compared to Ukrainian casualties. We've bombarded you with a ton of statistics so far in this video. Now let's get into what all of this means for Russia in the context of 2026 and the future of the Ukraine war. The first thing that we are seeing is the impact of Russia's attritional strategy in action. Russia has always played to its numerical advantage in every war that it's taken part in. Putin is just following the old Soviet playbook of throwing warm bodies at a problem until that problem goes away. The soldiers, missiles, drones, artillery, glide bombs, tanks, and everything else that Russia uses in Ukraine are all intended to gradually wear away at Ukraine's defenses. In other words, Russia's rate of advance was never going to be rapid, but what we should have been seeing were periods where Russia got held up against Ukraine's fortifications, with those delays being compensated by fast advances once the Russian forces broke through. Of course, we haven't seen that happen. Instead, and as the Kyiv Post notes, Ukraine's defense has been so strong that even the few tactical adaptations that Russia has made to its attritional strategy haven't resulted in the types of breakthroughs that Putin needs. Ukraine's front line certainly isn't collapsing. Rather, every cycle of sending Russian soldiers and equipment into the meat grinder just means that the Russian front line is destroying itself. We see this in the substantial losses of Russian military equipment that go along with the blood that Putin's war has spilled. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says that Russia's strategy has cost it over 11,600 tanks, more than 23,950 armored vehicles, around 36,730 artillery units, well over 118,000 drones, and many thousands more pieces of equipment. Basic logic tells us that these losses aren't sustainable, especially if Russia intends to make any actual breakthroughs. Assaults are getting weaker because Russia's armor is disappearing and its veterans are dying, only to be replaced by fresh recruits who die a lot faster. These aren't the only costs that Russia is enduring, but we'll come back to the second type of cost in a moment. Before that, let's return to something we mentioned earlier in the video. We told you that there was a reason why Russia was claiming to have captured settlements where battles are clearly still raging. And that reason is that Russia is trying to position itself as the country that has all of the momentum in the war. After all, a country that holds all of the cards is a country that gets a better deal out of the peace negotiations that have been ongoing between Ukraine and Russia for about a year. The New Voice of Ukraine pointed this out when reporting on Russia's false claim to have captured Kupiansk. It highlighted a report by the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, which said that the Kremlin was trying to create an alternative reality in the war that it could use to pressure the US into favoring Russia in peace talks. Again, it's simple logic. If Russia can convince the right people that city after city is falling to its might, it can also convince those people to push Ukraine to cede occupied territories to end the war. All of the CSIS figures that we've shared in this video shatter the smokescreen that Russia has tried to create. But if you think that's going to stop Russia from spreading its falsehoods, you're sadly mistaken. Putin has never let something so minor as the truth get in the way of what he wants, which means that Russia is still making claims that it can't back up. On January 27th, Russia's Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, made the claim that Russia had captured the settlement of Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. It hasn't. Russia's forces are still at least 10 kilometers, or around 6.2 miles, away from that particular settlement, according to the New Voice of Ukraine. The same general also claimed on the same day that Russia's forces are advancing in virtually all directions. Gerasimov said that Russia has seized 17 Ukrainian settlements and about 500 square kilometers, or around 193 miles of territory since January 1st. Again, it hasn't. The ISW claims that Russia's real gains are barely half that claimed by Gerasimov, landing at 265.45 square kilometers, or a little over 102 square miles for the period in question. This is lie after lie after lie, and it's all been blown apart by the CSIS and its revelations. But it's no wonder that the Kremlin is spreading these false stories. We mentioned earlier that Russia is paying a price other than those it's paying in blood and military equipment. Straightforward money is also a massive issue, with each passing day of Russia making almost non-existent gains inflicting a massive toll on the country's economy. CSIS covers the lowlights. In 2025, Russia's manufacturing sector suffered 7 consecutive months of contraction. The country's production levels fared even worse, 10 consecutive months of contraction out of 12. Inflation was, and still is, high in Russia, and that's been met with a decline in consumer demand, which in turn leads to further declines in manufacturing. And as for the economic growth that Russia seemed to be achieving during the first couple of years of the war, that has slowed to a crawl. In 2025, Russia's real gross domestic product, or GDP, was 0.6% off the back of a year that saw growth of 4.3%. And for 2026, the International Monetary Fund has projected 0.8% growth for Russia, which is a percentage that has been revised lower than the 1% that the organization previously forecast. Combine all of this with capital problems that come from shrinking oil revenues, a lack of foreign investment, minimal borrowing on the international markets, and Putin's short-sighted decision to spend about half of Russia's budget on the military, and you get a powder keg thrown on top of several others that are all coming close to blowing. So what does Russia have left? Nuclear weapons and a large military. That's about it, as it's running out of money, is bereft of innovation, and its large military is increasingly devoid of people with real knowledge or combat skills, because those people have been killed. Russia, then, is a power in decline. Its pathetic gains in Ukraine have just exposed what Putin has been trying to hide for years, which must have left Russia's president wondering. If he hadn't invaded Ukraine, could he still be pretending that Russia is one of the world's strongest countries? It's too late to answer that question now, leaving Putin with nothing but a future filled with the sorts of paltry gains and massive losses that we've seen since 2024. Ukraine has turned the tables on the Russian way of war, and the battle of attrition is now going in Ukraine's favor. Putin's only hope now is to convince Ukraine's Western allies to give up before his military collapses into oblivion. During the heady peak of the Soviet Union, Russia was among the most powerful nations on the planet. Untold thousands of units of equipment were built, all in preparation for a war with the US that never came. Little did the Soviet warmongers of the past know that their descendants will be using the equipment they built decades after its sell-by date. But that's what Russia is doing, and it's paying the price. Russia has been forced to deploy rotting Soviet armor as its reserves are depleted. Why? Ukraine obliterated everything else. Nowhere is this more apparent than with Russia's tanks and armored fighting vehicles. On January 24th, David Axe, writing for Euromaidan Press, made the remarkable claim that Russia has managed to replace all of its lost armored vehicle units once. But those replacements came from the rotting reserves Russia had dating back to the Soviet era. Now those reserves are gone, burned through just like so much of the armor that Russia sent into Ukraine. And with weaker armor now at the front, it's only a matter of time until Russia is left with the thin air that now sits above the tarmac of its storage facilities as potential replacements for the armor that Ukraine is going to destroy. It all seemed to start so well for Russia. When Putin launched his so-called special military operation, Russia had the numbers advantage all across the board. On the infantry fighting vehicle or IFV and armored personnel carrier or APC fronts, Russia entered Ukraine with 13,842 of these types of vehicles combined. That should have been more than enough for Russia to run roughshod over Ukraine, especially if the Kremlin's assumption that Ukraine would respond to the Russian invasion with a strategy that suited Russia's attritional style of warfare held true. That assumption was a miscalculation. Ukraine responded with an asymmetric strategy that is making it harder for Russia to even use its armor, as you'll learn a little later in the video. But during the first few years of the war, Putin was all in on the Russian strategy. Send enormous numbers of tanks, IFVs, and APCs, and Ukraine's defenses will eventually crumble. Instead, what we now see happening is that Russia's armor stockpile has gone up in smoke, and it's no longer in a position where it can send in replacements for whatever Ukraine takes out next. The numbers make for terrible reading for Russia, even if you only look at the numbers of confirmed tank and armored vehicle losses. Those numbers come from Oryx, which runs a live tracker of Russia's military losses that only accounts for the weapons that Russia loses that can be proven using photographic or video evidence made available to open-source intelligence communities. Even with this self-imposed limitation, Oryx records that Russia has lost 4,308 of its tanks, along with 8,735 of its AFVs and IFVs. For those keeping track at home, almost 9,000 AFVs and IFVs lost amount to about 2/3 of the entire fleet of those types of vehicles that Russia sent into Ukraine for Putin's initial invasion. And these are just confirmed losses. Oryx's numbers alone will be enough to make Putin weep. But if you listen to Ukraine, Russia has lost far more tanks and vehicles, which also implies that it had burned through even more of the armor stockpiles that we're about to cover. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says that Russia's tank losses stand at 11,605 as of January 25th. As for armored vehicles of all types, the ministry says that Russia has lost 23,950 of them. These are huge numbers, no matter which resource you believe. Even if the real numbers lie somewhere in the middle of these two sets of figures, nothing really changes for Russia. The reality that Putin must now face is that the stockpiles of already rusty and Soviet-era armor that he's been sending into Ukraine have run dry, and Russia's production numbers aren't anywhere near high enough to make up for the shortfall. Czech military analyst Jakub Janovský made that point in an X post, where he said that Russia's IFV and APC fleet is now in most regards approximately comparable or slightly larger to what the Russian military had operational at the start of the 2022 invasion. While that may sound like good news on the surface, this is only the case for Russia because it has depleted its reserves to keep the IFV and APC numbers up. Annual confirmed losses now sit at around 2,400, Euromaidan Press says, and production runs at about 900 IFVs and APCs annually. That leaves a 1,500 vehicle gap, and again, this is using Oryx's numbers rather than Ukraine's, which Russia needs to fill using stockpiles of Soviet armor that it just doesn't have anymore. Axe breaks down the numbers even further. He says that Russia is currently building its new BMP-3 tracked IFVs and its BTR-82 wheeled APCs at a rate of around 400 to 500 each per year. At best, that gives Russia 1,000 new IFVs and APCs annually, though the number is probably closer to 900. As for what the Ukraine war has cost Russia regarding these vehicles, Russia has confirmed losses of 3,600 of its 1960s and 1970s era BMP-1 and BMP-2 IFVs. 2,150 of the country's MTLB tracked APCs, also from the 70s, have been destroyed. Russia's more modern vehicles aren't faring any better either. Ukraine has taken out 1,900 of the BTR-82s we just mentioned, along with 890 of Russia's BMP-3s. Even the airborne IFV named the BMD isn't safe, as Ukraine has inflicted confirmed losses of 700 on the Russian military. Where this gets really bad for Russia is when we look at its remaining stockpiles. There's a key word that we're going to use here: usable. According to Axe, Russia's stockpiles of usable Soviet-era BMP-1s and BMP-2s sat at around 4,900 in 2022. Now it has 1,110 units of these vehicles left in storage. The numbers for MTLBs are just as bad, as Russia has gone from having 3,600 of these vehicles to 530. There are no BTR-82s left in storage, from a previous high of 1,400, meaning that all BTR-82s entering Ukraine now come fresh off a production line that isn't keeping up. Russia also only has 120 out of the 460 BMDs that it started the Ukraine invasion with. Now, there's a reason why we made a point of the word usable earlier. It's very true that Russia actually has thousands more IFVs and APCs in storage than these numbers state. However, the vast majority of these rotting Soviet vehicle carcasses that it has are in such terrible states of disrepair that the best thing that Russia can do is mine them for parts to replace the ever-dwindling numbers of vehicles it has that might be usable. These rotting stockpiles aren't fixable at a reasonable cost, at least. It's better to pour the money that could be spent on fixing these useless vehicles into building new ones, and we've already seen the limitations Russia has in that department. Here's what it all adds up to. Russia now has 1,800 usable IFVs and APCs in storage, and it's likely that many of those will need to be repaired to some degree. On top of that, it's building around 900 vehicles annually. Bear in mind that the 1,800 vehicles are a one-time resource. Once they're gone, they're gone. Russia has lost between 2,250 and 5,980 armored vehicles each year that the Ukraine war has raged, depending on whether you use the figures from Oryx or Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. You don't need to be a mathematical genius to see that none of this adds up. Even if Russia pulls everything that it has in storage right now, it has about a year's worth of IFVs and APCs left before it can no longer replace what it's losing. That's when the number of these types of vehicles in Ukraine will really start coming down, which will impact how much territory Russia is able to take in Ukraine. But we'll come back to that soon. First, all of these issues we're seeing with Russia's IFVs and APCs are also present with its tank stockpiles. We shared the Oryx and Ministry of Finance figures for Russia's tank losses earlier: 4,308 confirmed by Oryx and 11,605 claimed by Ukraine. By October 2025, the New Voice of Ukraine was reporting that Russia has exhausted its available stockpiles of tanks, though it still had 3,000 hulls that could theoretically be restored. Still, that's a pretty small number, especially if Ukraine is right about Russia's tank losses. Again, it's about a year's worth of supply of what are likely old Soviet tanks that are easy prey for Ukraine's drones. And according to Axe, the number of usable tanks in storage may actually be as low as 1,030. On the production front, Defense Express said in November that Russia is building about 250 of its modern T-90Ms per year, along with 150 T-80 BVMs, which is hardly anywhere near enough to make up for all of its losses. No matter where you look, Russia's armor is collapsing. In about a year, it won't have anything left in its stockpiles, meaning it will have to rely on production facilities that aren't even coming close to keeping pace with the sheer scale of IPV, APC, and tank losses Russia is experiencing in Ukraine. And this is exactly the kind of thing we cover at the Military Show. There's plenty more where underreported statistics like these came from too. So if you're getting value from the Military Show and you want to see more, don't forget to subscribe. Now, a few minutes ago we mentioned something that we talk about later in the video. Namely that even if Russia were to somehow magically replenish its depleted stockpiles of Soviet-era armor or bump up its production numbers to the tune of several thousand per year, it likely wouldn't mean all that much on the progress front. The reason for that is very simple. Having IPVs, APCs, and tanks doesn't mean a whole lot when Ukraine's asymmetric warfare tactics are making it almost impossible for Russia to use them as intended. Axe makes this point in his article for Euromaidan Press, stating, "Having vehicles on paper doesn't mean Russia can use them. Ukrainian mines, drones, and artillery make mechanized advances practically suicidal." He has a point. Russia's soldiers have grown increasingly distrustful of the armor that the Kremlin provides to them, assuming they receive any of that armor at all. United 24 Media made that point in a June article, where it stated that many of Russia's armored vehicles focus on firepower ahead of protection for the soldiers contained within. It brings up the example of the BMP-3 IFV that we discussed earlier. That IFV has a 100mm main cannon and a 30mm main gun, both of which can be formidable weapons if the Russian soldiers driving the vehicle are able to get within range of Ukraine's troops, but often it can't. Its armor is just too thin to withstand blasts from Ukraine's mines and especially its first-person view or FPV drones. The same goes for many of Russia's other armored vehicles. BMP-2 has side and rear armor that can be penetrated by using heavy machine guns, and frontal armor that's just 16mm thick. That's well less than an inch, and size matters when a kamikaze drone is bearing down on you. BTR-80 is even worse, as its side armor is just 7mm thick and can be penetrated by a heavy machine gun from a range of 500 meters or around 1,640 feet. Imagine that you're a Russian soldier. Your commander tells you and some of your comrades to load yourselves into one of these vehicles to take on a Ukrainian position. Only you're miles away from that position, and you know that there is a massive kill zone filled with mines, drones, and perhaps even Ukrainian units waiting in ambush at specially created choke points. Are you going to risk driving through a kill zone in a so-called armored vehicle that can be shredded like paper by almost anything stronger than a standard rifle? Of course not. You'd probably prefer to go on foot, and you're going to find out soon why that doesn't work either. We just touched on the damage that Ukraine's FPV drones can do, and they have become the biggest barrier to Russia using what few armored vehicles and tanks it has left in any appreciable manner. We only need a handful of incidents from the last couple of days to illustrate. On January 25th, UKR Inform reported that Ukraine's unmanned systems forces had destroyed 2 tanks and 29 vehicles in just 24 hours. On the same date, Defense Express shared a video of Ukraine's FPV drones hunting down and constantly bombarding a Russian turtle tank until it was destroyed. These aren't special types of tanks, by the way. Turtle tanks are Russia's way of trying to deal with the problem of most of its tanks coming from the Soviet era. T-62s and T-72s are wrapped up in makeshift modifications, often welded armor shells, that make them heavier and harder to drive in exchange for some scant protection against drones. It mostly doesn't work. Ukraine just has to send a few more FPV drones to take out one of these tanks. Desperation has become Russia's only form of defense, and we see that in the armor alternatives that it's fielding in Ukraine. As Axe points out, last year Russian regiments effectively parked their armor most of the time and instead attacked on foot, motorcycles, or even horseback. Lighter, smaller modes of transport stand a better chance of evading overhead surveillance. Of course, a better chance of evasion doesn't mean a 100% chance. Far from it. Russia's horseback rides may be trying to channel the spirits of their medieval ancestors, but that doesn't mean much when Ukraine's drones find them and bear down. Russia is trying to hide this particularly desperate tactic behind a mask of bravado and reverence for the brave, and certainly not terrified to the point that they're happy that they're wearing brown pants, soldiers who are dying on their horses. On January 7th, Forbes even reported that Russian media had tried to praise the so-called inventiveness of the soldiers attempting attacks on Ukraine's defenses while on horseback. That's one way to create an alternative version of the real story, which is that Russia's rotting armor is so useless that its soldiers may now have a better chance of succeeding by riding into battle on a horse. The fact that these cavalry charges are so often destroyed may not mean much to Putin. He and the Kremlin may even be happy about it. At least a dead soldier riding on a horse hasn't wasted one of the armored vehicles that Russia can't afford to lose anymore. Horses hardly offer a viable alternative to armor. And that brings us to another major problem that Russia has, and one we mentioned earlier. Real breakthroughs against Ukraine's defenses aren't possible without the armored vehicles and tanks that Russia has burned through. And by real breakthroughs, we mean any that happen at anything more than a snail's pace without incurring the losses of tens of thousands of Russia's soldiers in the process. Axe puts it well when he says, "Armored vehicles remain the best method of rapidly exploiting a breach in enemy defenses. That Russia can't deploy them for their intended purpose means that, barring a total collapse in Ukraine's defenses, the Kremlin has no way of breaking through." Russia has instead switched to attacking Ukraine's defenses with small units of infantry, including many soldiers attempting to advance on foot, for tiny gains of only a kilometer or so at a time. Assuming there are any gains at all, the predictable outcome is that Russia is churning through soldiers at an enormous rate. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, highlighted this in its December 31st assessment of Russia's campaign in Ukraine. According to the ISW, Russia managed to capture just 5,304 square kilometers, or about 3,295 square miles, of territory in 2025. And even that number is misleading, as 473 square kilometers, or around 293 square miles, is accounted for by territory that Russia took back from Ukraine in Kursk, rather than territory it captured in Ukraine by itself. In return for this territory, Russia suffered 416,570 casualties. That amounts to 78 casualties for every square kilometer gained in Ukraine and Kursk, which is where the real problem lies for the Kremlin. Russia has simply swapped losing armor for losing soldiers. Both are finite resources. In its own December 30th report, Mediazona points out that Russia's 2025 was even worse than it first appears. As Russia claims that it has a military on the rise and that it will soon overwhelm Ukraine, its army is made up of increasingly older volunteers who are being sent into war to serve as little more than cannon fodder for Ukraine's defenses. Russia has officially switched to a strategy of saving vehicles and spending men, Mediazona reports, which is only further evidence that its stockpiles are as low as Axe claims. As for the aging men claim, Mediazona's data, which only covers Russia's losses confirmed via obituaries and official casualty reports, suggests that the average age of Russian casualties is trending toward 50, with the most frequent age of death recorded in 2025 being between 46 and 52. It seems that sending middle-aged men to do the job that armored vehicles and tanks can't do isn't working out too well for Putin. Russia has at least recognized this fact. According to Forbes, Russia has been experimenting with new tank tactics that it believes stand a better chance of achieving success than the tactics used before. Now, Russia is pairing 2 tanks with a small fleet of drones. The drones buzz around, coordinating fire and providing the tanks with greater spatial awareness, all as the tanks continuously switch positions so they can lay down fire without becoming stationary targets. Of course, Russia hasn't solved the problem of dealing with the fact that Ukraine's drone operators typically operate from outside of a tank's firing range, meaning FPV drones can still attack and take out the tanks long before they reach the Ukrainian defenses on which they want to fire. And if the tank operators don't have enough supplies such as food, fuel, or ammunition, then they can't do much of anything. Still, Russia is trying to adapt. It just looks like a case of too little too late, and it doesn't do anything for the many lost IFVs and APCs. If anything, Russia is just placing greater pressure on its already strained logistics, Forbes says, which may mean that this new strategy is a non-starter. While all of these problems amount to very bad news for Russia as it attempts to make gains in Ukraine without losing the rest of its armor, there are also issues for the future. Russia wants to build a military that's strong enough to take on NATO, and it's not going to do that when dealing with so many losses. Fear is creeping into the Kremlin, as it knows that there is one European country in particular that could ruin Putin's future plans.
This is the story of Ukraine's scaled-down kill zone strategy and how it's breaking Russia's front line from within. Let's jump straight in, starting with a single number that directly showcases Ukraine's massive success: 1.45%. That's how much Ukrainian territory has been captured between 2023 and 2025. At the same time, Russia has been estimated to have suffered around 1.2 million casualties, including deaths and severe injuries. The equipment losses are equally as catastrophic, with over 16,100 armored vehicles. And the country's financial toll has resulted in Russian President Vladimir Putin announcing that it would need to cut military spending for 2026, the first time in 10 years, all in the middle of an active military conflict. Think about that for a moment. Russia has basically ruined itself, and all it got was less than 2% of Ukraine's territory. In 2023, Russian forces managed to capture a meager 188 square miles. The year 2024 saw better results, with about 1,500 square miles seized, but that still amounts to less than 1% of Ukraine's total territory. By 2025, Russia's advances had slowed to a crawl, sometimes averaging just 150 to 400 feet per day in key sectors like Kupiansk and Pokrovsk. To put this in perspective, that's slower than the Allied advance during the Battle of the Somme in World War I, which was one of history's most infamous examples of attritional grinding. And at the heart of Russia's inability to break through lies Ukraine's revolutionary kill zone strategy, a defensive concept that's fundamentally transformed how modern war is fought. But to understand why this strategy is so devastating, we need to look at how it differs from every major war of the 20th century. During World War I, trenches dominated the battlefield. Soldiers dug in, artillery pounded positions for days, and then infantry went over the top into no man's land, hoping to overwhelm enemy positions through sheer numbers. The kill zone was defined by machine gun range, which was maybe a few hundred yards of open ground where attackers were vulnerable. If you made it across that deadly space, you had a chance. World War II brought mobility back to warfare. Blitzkrieg tactics used combined arms, including early tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry to punch through defensive lines and exploit breakthroughs. The kill zone became more dynamic, but it was still measured in miles, up to a few of them. Air superiority mattered, but close air support required dedicated aircraft missions and forward air controllers. Even during the Cold War, when NATO and the Warsaw Pact faced off across Central Europe, defensive planning centered on layered positions. Both sides made concrete bunkers, tank obstacles, and minefields, all designed to channel enemy armor into predetermined kill zones where anti-tank weapons can engage them. These were static, carefully planned defensive belts. Ukraine's kill zone strategy went in a completely different direction. Today's kill zone isn't a fixed line on a map or a few hundred meters of open ground. It's a 15 to 25 mile deep zone of constant, omnipresent death that can strike anywhere, anytime, with almost perfect precision. And it's all thanks to the most disruptive military technology since the machine gun: drones. Think about the economics of aerial warfare in the 20th century. During World War II, launching a bombing raid required building massive bombers costing millions of dollars, training crews for months, organizing complex missions with dozens or hundreds of aircraft, and accepting that many wouldn't return. A single strategic bombing mission might involve thousands of personnel and tens of millions in equipment. Fast forward to today, a Ukrainian soldier sitting in a concealed dugout can launch a $400 FPV drone, guide it 15 miles across the battlefield, and destroy a Russian tank worth $3 million. The entire process takes minutes. But more importantly, the operation has minimal staffing requirements. You don't need a flight crew, a massive logistics operation, or an elaborate mission plan to pull it all off. All it takes is one drone and a better than average drone operator with up-to-date battlefield intel and fast reflexes. The ubiquity of these drones has made traditional trench warfare tactics completely obsolete. The late 20th century Soviet doctrine, which both Russia and Ukraine inherited, emphasized concentration of forces in large, heavily fortified strongpoints. The thinking was simple: mass your troops and equipment in well-defended positions, and you can hold out against artillery and armor assaults. But drones changed everything. By 2023, those concentrated positions became death traps. Wide trenches that once protected soldiers from artillery have now become easy targets for FPV drones. Large platoon-sized dugouts that seemed impregnable became mass graves when a single grenade-carrying drone could strike them with near-perfect accuracy. And the zone has actually expanded. Remember that 15 to 25 mile zone from earlier? Well, the International Center for Defense and Security noted that the kill zone started at around 3 to 5 miles out and then slowly grew as technology and equipment improved. More importantly for Ukraine, it recognized this shift faster than Russia and completely redesigned its defensive strategy. Instead of predetermined fortifications and static defensive lines like the French Maginot Line or Germany's Atlantic Wall, Ukraine built a shifting, adaptive front line that maximizes the lethality of drone warfare while minimizing vulnerability. Here's how it works in practice. Ukraine's new fortification system spans over 1,200 miles across Donetsk, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk regions. But calling it a line is misleading. It's more accurate to think of it as a layered network of kill zones. The first layer consists of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, networks of thin metal wires called plutanka that slow infantry movement, and anti-tank ditches with barbed wire at the bottom to prevent soldiers from using them for cover. Then come the dragon's teeth, which are concrete tetrahedra connected by thick metal cables and wrapped in multiple rows of barbed wire. All of these obstacles are designed not to stop Russian forces, but to slow them down and channel them into predetermined corridors. And that's where the real killing begins. Behind these obstacles, Ukraine has deployed a dense network of micro-fortifications. These are small, camouflaged positions that house drone operators in groups of just a few soldiers. They're also dispersed, often housing just one soldier to serve as the lookout or operator. But each is equipped with multiple types of drones that can cover ranges of up to 15 miles. This dispersion is critical. In traditional warfare, finding and destroying a command post or artillery position could cripple an entire sector. But when your defensive network consists of hundreds of small, independent cells, each capable of calling in strikes across vast distances, there's no single point of failure. Russia can destroy one position in one day, 2 positions the next, maybe a dozen positions over the course of a week. It ultimately doesn't matter. As the network adapts, other cells take over, and the kill zone remains lethal. The ability to monitor this shifting front line comes from Ukraine's sophisticated drone reconnaissance network. Unlike 20th century warfare, where intelligence gathering required high-altitude aircraft or satellites, Ukrainian forces can maintain constant surveillance using cheap commercial drones. As one Ukrainian operator explained, fiber optic drones can film from half a meter above the ground, making it far easier to spot targets than the 300 to 600 meter altitude required for fixed-wing systems. This constant surveillance enables Ukraine's most revolutionary tactical shift: hit-and-run mobile warfare supported by ground robots. This is where Ukraine has truly leapfrogged traditional military thinking and potentially every other military in the world. By the end of 2025, Ukraine is poised to deploy 15,000 unmanned ground vehicles. Think about what that means. These aren't just remote-controlled toys. They're sophisticated robotic platforms that can carry up to 660 pounds of ammunition or supplies, evacuate wounded soldiers under fire, plant mines, deliver explosive payloads to fortified positions, or even mount machine guns for suppressive fire. The impact on Ukrainian tactics has been profound. In December 2024, Ukrainian forces conducted the world's first fully unmanned assault on Russian positions using only ground robots and FPV drones, with no human infantry involved in the direct assault. By July 2025, Ukrainian forces captured Russian troops without deploying any infantry whatsoever, relying entirely on drones and ground-based robotic systems. This creates an artificial presence on the battlefield without risking actual human troops. Instead of sending soldiers into the kill zone to hold positions or conduct assaults, Ukraine can deploy robots that move supplies, screen areas for threats, and engage targets while human operators remain safely in concealed positions kilometers away. When Russia destroys one of these robots, Ukraine loses equipment, not lives. The mathematics of attrition shifts dramatically in Ukraine's favor. But here's what makes Ukraine's strategy truly genius: the speed of innovation. In modern warfare, technological advantage is measured not in years or even months, but in weeks. Russia introduced fiber optic drones in the spring of 2024, and they immediately made headlines as the next unbeatable weapon. Unlike traditional radio-controlled drones, fiber optic drones trail a thin cable as they fly, connecting them directly to their operator. This makes them immune to electronic warfare jamming and provides crystal clear video feeds right up to impact. Military analysts worldwide considered it a potentially game-changing adaptation of going back to analog designs that would give Russia a decisive edge. Ukraine responded by capturing Russian fiber optic drones, reverse engineering them, identifying their weaknesses, and building better versions within months. By summer 2024, Ukrainian companies like 3D Tech have started developing their own fiber optic drones. But they didn't just copy the Russian designs, they improved them dramatically. Ukrainian engineers replaced Russia's heavy frames with lightweight carbon fiber, dramatically improved the spool design to reduce drag and friction, optimized weight distribution for better flight characteristics, and developed systems that could reach 15 to 25 miles away, far exceeding Russian capabilities at the time. Notably, this range coincided with the development of the kill zone as we see it today. The Ukrainian fiber optic drones became lighter, faster, and more reliable, and could hit targets at longer ranges than their Russian counterparts. What's more, Ukraine built a massive domestic production capacity, with over 200 companies now working on drone development and dozens of models approved for military use. This decentralized competitive ecosystem ensures constant innovation as companies race to develop better, cheaper, more effective systems. This pattern repeats across every domain of the war. Russia develops a new tactic or technology. Ukraine analyzes it, adapts it, and deploys an improved version faster than Russia can scale up production. It's an innovation cycle that would make Silicon Valley jealous, except the feedback loop happens on an active battlefield where lessons are measured in lives saved or lost. And this is where Ukraine's kill zone strategy becomes something far bigger than just one country's defensive tactics. It's reshaping global military thinking and potentially redefining Western defense strategies for decades to come. NATO members are now openly acknowledging that they need to learn from Ukraine and not the other way around. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen stated it bluntly. The only expert right now in the world when it comes to anti-drone capacities is Ukraine, because they're fighting the Russian drones almost every day. We need to take all the experiences, all the new technology, all the innovation from Ukraine and incorporate it into our own rearmament. Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski echoed this sentiment even more directly. It's the Ukrainians who'll be training us on how to stand up to Russia, not the other way around. This represents a fundamental inversion of the traditional relationship between NATO and Ukraine. For decades, NATO tried to bring Ukraine up to alliance standards through training programs and military reforms. Now, after 3 years of the most intense drone warfare in history, NATO countries are going to school on Ukrainian tactics. In September 2025, following Russian drone incursions into Polish airspace, Poland and Ukraine announced plans for Ukraine to provide anti-drone training in Poland. Britain is mass-producing interceptor drones developed in collaboration with Ukraine. Romania has unveiled plans to manufacture drones in partnership with Ukrainian companies for domestic use and potential export to NATO allies. Even the United States, the world's preeminent military power, is reportedly negotiating a landmark deal to acquire battle-tested Ukrainian drone technology. NATO established the Joint Analysis Training and Education Center in Poland, specifically to leverage real-time lessons from the Ukrainian conflict. The alliance is fundamentally rethinking its air defense doctrine to focus on swarms of cheap attack drones rather than expensive missiles and fighter jets. The previous method of deploying a $4 million Patriot missile or an F-35 sortie to shoot down a $400 drone is simply economically unsustainable. The broader implications are staggering. Ukraine has demonstrated that smaller nations can challenge larger adversaries in key military technologies if they move faster, innovate constantly, and integrate the private sector into their defense strategy. The traditional Western model of defense procurement, which takes years or even decades to field new systems through rigid bureaucratic processes, has been completely outpaced by Ukraine's battle-driven development cycle that measures improvements in weeks. Former Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny predicted that future wars would be won by countries that focus their resources on drones, electronic warfare, and artificial intelligence. The Russia-Ukraine war has become the world's largest live-fire testing ground for these technologies, and every military power is watching closely and adapting its doctrines based on Ukrainian innovations. Even China is studying how cheap unmanned systems can challenge expensive traditional forces. Taiwan is examining how drone wars can defend against amphibious invasions. Israel is analysing how robotic systems can reduce casualties in urban warfare. The lessons from Ukraine's kill zone strategy are spreading globally, potentially reshaping how every nation thinks about defense. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: technological superiority in modern warfare is temporary and fragile. What matters isn't having the best equipment at the start of a conflict, but the ability to adapt faster than your enemy, to innovate under pressure, to fail quickly and learn faster, and to create a whole-of-society approach that harnesses civilian innovation for military purposes. Ukraine's kill zone strategy works not because Ukrainian drones are necessarily better than Russian ones on a one-to-one basis, but because Ukraine has built an entire military-industry ecosystem. The concentration of independent companies pooling their data, resources, and getting feedback in practically real time from actual combat situations means that they can iterate and improve faster than Russia's centralized bureaucratic defense industrial complex. Every day, Ukrainian engineers receive feedback from frontline operators about what works and what doesn't. Every week, new modifications appear on drones in the field. Every month, new capabilities emerge that weren't possible the month before. This creates a compounding advantage that grows over time, even as Russia tries desperately to keep pace. Russia is learning that you can't brute force your way through a modern kill zone. You can't overwhelm it with artillery when drones spot your guns and strike them before they can relocate. You can't use massed armor when every tank that enters the zone faces dozens of FPV drones. You can't rely on electronic warfare when fiber optic drones are immune to jamming. You can't even safely resupply your frontline troops when logistics routes extending 20 kilometers behind the line are under constant surveillance and attack. The kill zone strategy has essentially turned the entire concept of offensive warfare on its head. In traditional military thinking, the offensive has the initiative. They choose when and where to attack, forcing the defender to spread forces to cover all possible approaches. But in drone-saturated warfare, the defender has perfect awareness of the battlefield and can concentrate overwhelming firepower on any point instantly without moving a single soldier. This is Ukraine's genius, turning Russia's own preferred tactics into strategic liabilities. Russia excels at wars of attrition, at throwing massive resources at problems until they crack. But what happens when every soldier, every tank, every artillery piece you commit to the offensive enters a kill zone where it faces not opposing infantry, but an omnipresent network of autonomous weapons that can strike from any direction at any time? You get exactly what we've seen over the past 3 years, the slowest, most costly offensive in modern military history, where Russia trades 1 million casualties for a percentage of territory, where generals send wave after wave of troops into what they themselves call the meat grinder, where the economic cost of the war is draining Russia's reserves, while Ukraine's defensive strategy requires a fraction of the resources. And here's the truly terrifying part for Russia. This kill zone advantage isn't static, it's growing. Every month, Ukrainian drones might get better, cheaper, and more numerous. Every month, more ground robots join the battlefield, reducing the need for human infantry. Every month, more countries share technology and tactics with Ukraine, while Russia becomes increasingly isolated. Ukraine started by having practically no drone industry, only to end up building over 5 million drones in 2025. And Russia knows this. That's why the Kremlin is actively pushing for negotiations that would freeze the conflict and give them the territory they failed to conquer militarily. They understand that time is not on their side, that every month Ukraine's defensive advantages grow while Russia's offensive capacity erodes. Remember, Russia started this war with roughly 900,000 active troops. They've now suffered 1.2 million casualties. They've essentially cycled through their entire pre-war military and had to recruit, mobilize, or coerce a completely new army, and then some. And this new army is increasingly made up of the desperate, the highly motivated, or those with ulterior motives, up to and including Ukrainian resistant agents who deliberately infiltrate Russian forces to sabotage operations from within. Russia's defense budget for 2025 reached an astounding 40% of government spending, figures not seen since the height of the Cold War. Yet, despite this massive investment, Russia's military-industrial complex has practically collapsed as an export industry. Everything Russia produces must be kept domestically, creating an economic death spiral where military production consumes ever larger portions of GDP without generating revenue. Meanwhile, that same military production relies on railways to transport equipment to the front line. Those same railways are increasingly targeted by Ukrainian sabotage operations. Tanks and ammunition sit in storage, useless to the front, because the trains can't safely deliver them. And even when equipment reaches the front lines, it enters the kill zone where drones await. This is the culmination of Ukraine's strategy, a defensive system that actively degrades Russia's capacity to wage war by imposing unsustainable costs on every offensive operation. It's attrition warfare flipped on its head, where the numerically smaller defender inflicts disproportionate losses on the supposedly superior attacker. And the world is taking notice. If Ukraine can hold off a nuclear superpower for 3 years and counting through technological innovation and adaptive tactics, future conflicts are going to look a lot different from what we've seen before 2022.
How many times can Russia keep on raising an army to replace its dead? It's a question that Ukraine has asked many times before, as the seemingly relentless grind of Russian soldiers being sent to their doom against Ukraine's defenses appears to have no end. But that end is coming. There is now a light at the end of the tunnel as Vladimir Putin's manpower crisis explodes. Stretched to the breaking point by historic troop losses, Russia is finally struggling to replace its dead. And that claim comes from no less than Secretary General of NATO Mark Rutte. According to Rutte, Russia's massive monthly losses, which he claims reach up to 25,000 soldiers, and maybe higher as you'll soon learn, are unsustainable. The Russians at the moment are losing massive amounts of their soldiers thanks to the Ukrainian defense, Business Insider reported Rutte as saying during the Global Europe Conference in Brussels. The outlet's report, which was published on January 14th, went on to note that Rutte clarified his statement with the revelation that the exceptionally high numbers he shared weren't Russia's casualty rate. They were the country's death rate. "I'm not talking seriously wounded, killed," Rutte declared, adding, "Now they lose this amount or more in 1 month, so that's also unsustainable on their side." It's a remarkable claim for Rutte to make, especially as Russia has managed to prove that Putin's sole tactic of throwing soldiers at the Ukrainian problem until that problem goes away was sustainable, at least up until this point. Every time it seemed that Russia was on the verge of losing too many soldiers, another trick would be pulled from the Russian sleeve. Russia is still trying to play its tricks, and will explore what some of them are soon, but the difference is that the recruiting tactics that have worked so well for almost 4 years are starting to fall. What Russia is left with are monthly losses that exceed the total losses that the former Soviet Union suffered during its entire war with Afghanistan. That war saw the Soviet Union lose an estimated 15,000 of its soldiers during a little more than 9 years. That amounts to about 1,666 soldiers annually, or about 138 soldiers per month. Even if NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte's lower-end estimate of 20,000 Russian deaths per month is accurate, that would mean that Russia is now losing roughly 5,000 more soldiers per month in Ukraine than it did over 9 years of war in Afghanistan. At this point, there's a case to be made that Putin is a mass murderer of his own people, and the craziest thing is that Rutte's figures may be an underestimate. On January 8th, both Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and the Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's Armed Forces, Oleksandr Syrskyi, revealed that Rutte's monthly kill estimate may be off to the tune of several thousand. Al Jazeera reports Zelensky is claiming that the number of Russian deaths has exceeded 25,000 every month since October. In December, 35,000 occupiers were eliminated, and this has been confirmed with video footage, Zelensky claimed, adding, "In November, there were 30,000, and in October, 26,000 eliminated occupiers." Not only are all of these numbers higher than Russia's estimate, there's also a clear pattern at play. Russia's death count rose by between 4,000 and 5,000 soldiers per month during the final 3 months of 2025, according to Zelensky. That pattern doesn't bode well for Putin's 2026 plans, and Syrskyi confirmed that the numbers that Zelensky shared are mostly accurate. Also on January 8th, Al Jazeera reported the Ukrainian military's commander-in-chief as stating, "The enemy lost over 33,000 personnel in December. This figure includes only confirmed video cases, but the actual losses of the occupiers are greater." Syrskyi then went on to share another interesting nugget of information, adding, "The first month when the unmanned systems units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces neutralized approximately as many servicemen of the occupying army as Russia conscripted in a month." There are hints in this statement that Russia isn't recruiting as well as it needs to recruit, and that Ukraine's drones are doing most of the damage to the Russian military as we head into 2026. Keep watching to discover that there's a lot more than a handful of hints happening here. But right now, something might be bugging you. It's one thing for Ukraine to claim that it's killed anywhere between 20,000 and 35,000 Russian soldiers per month, but claims don't mean much of anything. You could claim to be king of the world, and it wouldn't mean much if you didn't have the crown, scepter, robe, and fancy patter to prove it. Evidence is more important than numbers, and Ukraine needs it if it's going to substantiate any of these claims. Ukraine has that evidence, and it's on a platform that is accessible to Ukrainian military personnel. That platform is called the Delta system, and it's somewhat similar to a Discord server that's made available to Ukraine's armed forces.
Via the Delta system, Ukrainian soldiers can look at battle maps and, crucially, see the live feeds being recorded by the drones that Ukraine is using to attack Russia's troops. The system, which was created in 2021, offers Ukraine a form of situational awareness on its territory that Russia can't match, and it can be accessed anywhere. As Grey Dynamics points out, the Delta system does not require specific settings and is ready to use on laptops, tablets, or mobile phones. Its user-friendly design shows images collected from drones, satellites, human intelligence sources, and sensors. All of this information can be accessed via an interactive map, making Delta the ideal source for Ukraine to use when it wants to confirm the number of kills that it scores against Russia. Granted, the average person can't simply jump onto Delta to see what it shows Ukraine, but the footage of Ukraine's drones kills is there, and it can be verified by any Ukrainian soldier who cares to view it. Should those soldiers care to look, they will discover that there is one massive difference maker that has led to Ukraine killing so many of Russia's soldiers during the last few months. It's a difference maker that has existed for several years at this point, though Ukraine's use of it seems to have leveled up. Of course, we're talking about drones. And what we're seeing now is that Ukraine's drones alone are killing more soldiers than Putin can bring into the Russian military. The December figures that Siersky shared serve as the turning point on Russia's recruitment front, and it's all due to Ukraine's drones. Euromaidan Press shared some interesting statistics in a January 6th article, where it highlighted just how vital Ukraine's drones have become to everything that it does now. In December alone, units operating Ukraine's unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, carried out 339,000 missions. It's an insane number that breaks down to about 10,935 missions daily. What was likely a sharp uptick in drone operations clearly bore fruit. As Siersky claims, per Euromaidan Press, the number of targets that Ukraine hit with its drones rose by 31% in December, with the number of Russian soldiers hit by UAVs rising by more than 25%. However, these crazy numbers aren't even the most impressive part of this portion of the story. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces comprise just 2.2% of all Ukraine's military personnel. To offer some perspective on that percentage, Global Firepower says that Ukraine's military has 900,000 active personnel. 2.2% of 900,000 is just 19,800 people. Now think back to the figures that Rutte, Zelensky, and Siersky have shared. Ukraine's drone operators are killing more Russian soldiers each month than the total number of drone operators Ukraine has, every single month. If a military wants efficiency, Ukraine is showcasing exactly where that efficiency comes from. Naturally, Ukraine isn't going to let up on the drone front. It's building more and better drones that will allow its operators to increase their kill counts as they bleed the Russian military dry in the process. On the numbers front, Ukraine is building about 4 million drones annually, per a November 12th report by the Kyiv Post. Not all of these drones are being used to kill Russia's soldiers, at least not directly. Ukraine also builds reconnaissance UAVs that allows its troops both behind the drone controls and on the ground to react to Russia's movements. Again, the Delta system comes into play here. Ukraine is also building thousands of long-range drones, which it's using to slowly erode the Russian war machine from the inside with strikes on Russian energy, logistics, and equipment. Not direct kills perhaps, but the less that Russia has to give to its soldiers, the more likely those soldiers are to die on the Ukrainian battlefield. Still, the vast majority of the 4 million per year are FPV drones, like those recording the kills that Rutte, Zelensky, and Siersky have highlighted. Those drones are only going to get better with time. On January 14th, Euromaidan Press reported on a meeting between Ukraine's top military and security leaders. During that meeting, a decision was made to increase the effectiveness of Ukraine's drone line, which is the drone-infested kill zone that runs between 10 and 15 kilometers or 6.2 and 9.3 miles deep across the entire front line. Ukraine's former Minister of Defense Rustem Amirov commented on the meeting in a Telegram post where he said, "The Ministry of Defense is instructed to streamline and ensure a clear distribution of funds between means of destruction, as well as find additional financial opportunities to cover the urgent needs of the defense forces. They also focused on scaling up the production of fiber optic drones, taking into account the range and accuracy of destruction." Drones have already proven themselves to be very effective killers of Russia's soldiers. Now Ukraine appears ready to make more, to make those drones more capable, and that means what we've seen in recent months regarding Russia's death rate may just be the start of a much bigger problem that's going to plague Putin and his cronies in 2026 and beyond, should the war not end this year. Still, Russia has solved this type of problem before. How? More and more recruitment. And if you remember what we told you earlier in the video about Russia's military recruitment, then you can probably guess what we're going to say next. Putin's time-tested solution isn't working as well as he needs it to anymore. There are a few reasons why. But before we tell you what they are, we hope that you're enjoying this video. If you are, we'd appreciate it if you like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us what you think about everything we've told you so far. It all helps the channel, and your support means we can keep bringing you insight into military matters all over the world.
Back to Russia's recruitment. Putin has been able to rely on a pretty simple strategy for much of the Ukraine war. All that the Kremlin has to do is find some of the poorest regions in Russia, locate socially vulnerable men, and then flash more cash than those men have ever seen in their lives in front of them. Just like that, Russia has contract soldiers, which has been hiring by the tens of thousands every month. The Kremlin specifically targets the Russians who have no future prospects, and it does so by advertising in places where those types of people are more likely to be, as Politico reported back in May 2025. Where Putin once used summons and subpoenas to push people into Russia's military, he was now using huge amounts of money, attractive benefits packages, and even appeals to the fragile manhood of the men that Russia targeted to get what he wanted. Russia created what amounted to a military marketplace, and according to Ekaterina Schulman, who is a political scientist at the Osteuropa Institute in Germany, the marketplace was focused on the very specific demographics. These measures target a specific demographic: socially vulnerable men, men with debts, criminal records, little financial literacy, or those trapped by predatory microcredit, people on the margins with no prospects, Schulman tells Politico. And it all worked out well for a while. But now Russia is starting to see some strange things happen with its recruitment efforts. It all started in some of the examples of poorer regions of Russia that have been a wellspring of new soldiers for Putin for much of the war. In October, the Kyiv Post reported on the state of Russia's recruitment efforts in the Republic of Sakha, which is also known as Yakutia. There, recruitment centers have been falling short of their quotas by about 40%. Putin's ridiculous quotas likely played a role. However, discontent among the residents, particularly the indigenous Yakuts, Evans, and Evenki ethnic groups from which Russia had drawn so many times before, was also rife. These ethnic minorities don't want to die in Putin's war, and Russia is struggling to offer the financial incentives it needs to convince the types of people that it's been recruiting up until now to join. It's almost as though treating your soldiers like cannon fodder isn't the best approach. It's an approach that is biting Putin on the rear in a remarkable way, so keep watching to find out how. On the money front, Putin's entire strategy of using Russia's massive attrition rate to break Ukraine down is one that relies on a pretty massive recruitment budget. Indeed, IntelliNews reports that Russian military recruitment bonuses cost the Kremlin about $4 billion during the first half of 2025 alone. And that's a point in itself. This is money that Russia spent on bonuses alone. By the end of 2025, IntelliNews claimed Russia would have likely spent about $10 billion on bonuses, without considering wages, training costs, and equipping its soldiers. Never mind Russia's death rate, this kind of spending isn't sustainable, and the cracks are starting to show. In October, the Jamestown Foundation reported that many of Russia's federal subjects are quietly reducing the size of the bonuses that they're offering to recruits. Those federal subjects, such as the Republic of Sakha that we mentioned earlier, seem to have gotten this crazy idea that spending their money on essential services such as schools and hospitals is probably better than giving it to the people who are just going to get sent to Ukraine to die. What this all amounts to is that the Russian recruitment budget is running low. And now the Kremlin is getting more desperate. It has started using covert tactics to recruit more foreign soldiers as it tries to fill the gaps left by some of its regions failing to hit their recruitment quotas. Social media campaigns promising what sounds like easy work away from the Ukraine war's front lines are being used to entice people from other countries to sign up for Putin's war. Of course, these promised non-combat roles end up turning into the foreign recruits being sent into the meat grinder. According to ABC News, Russia has recruited at least 18,000 foreign soldiers from 128 countries since the war began. 3,388 of those soldiers have died in a war that most were told they wouldn't have to fight as of December 7th. On January 13th, The Guardian reported on the case of Yemeni men falling for Putin's deception and the effect that ending up on the Ukraine war's front lines is having on them. The outlet shares a quote from one unnamed soldier from Yemen who filmed himself saying, "We die 1,000 times a day from the terror we endure at the hands of the Russians. Save your Yemeni brothers. We're being forced to fight. Our friends are dead. We are trapped between life and death." Beyond being a brutal commentary on the war that Putin has created, this statement is a warning. Russia is trying to deceive foreign soldiers into fighting Putin's war. The more information like this gets out, the less that Russia will be able to rely on people from other nations to plug the gaps caused by its domestic recruitment failures. What we are now seeing from all this is a Russian military that is on the cusp of a manpower crisis. And that crisis is leading to the painful bite to Putin's rear that we mentioned earlier in the video. Russia's cannon fodder tactics aren't only unsustainable because of the number of its soldiers being killed by Ukraine's drones, or its increasing desperation to recruit by any means possible as more people refuse to fight for Putin. In Ukraine itself, Russian officers are doing something that the Kremlin never thought they would do: rebelling against Russia's cannon fodder tactics. The Daily Express reports that military personnel in the Donetsk region of Ukraine, and especially those destined to assault the embattled city of Pokrovsk, are increasingly appealing to be moved anywhere else. These claims come from the pro-Ukrainian partisan group Artesh, which says that officers are practically begging their superiors to send them to the rear because they don't want to die in Pokrovsk. The command is keeping officers in check with threats of disciplinary penalties, demotions, and complete career blocking, Artesh claims before adding, officers are harshly reprimanded for the surrender of positions by their subordinates, are required to report on a stable situation that does not actually exist, and are forced to sign documents that are far from reality. Fear is at an all-time high among Russia's soldiers, and that is as dangerous to Putin's ambition of capturing Ukraine as Russia's recruitment issues. And it gets worse. So terrified are many of Russia's officers, and even some of its commanders, that they're doing things to themselves that actively contribute to the massive Russian death rate that is causing Russia's manpower problems in the first place. Those officers and commanders are drinking heavily. On December 24th, United 24 media reported on what Artesh calls Russia's Alko Battalion. An Artesh agent embedded with the 4th Battalion of Russia's 74th Motorized Rifle Brigade says that the company's commanders drink heavily when stationed on the front lines, to the point where they deliver their orders to regular soldiers while being so under the influence that they are utterly detached from the reality of what's happening on the ground. The impact of this unique approach to modern warfare is about what you would expect. Casualties in the Alko Battalion amount to up to 100 killed and wounded per month, significantly more than other units, the Artesh agent says. But no matter how these commanders try to drown their sorrows as their officers beg to be reassigned, the Kremlin continues to order assaults. Russia's soldiers run in fear toward Ukraine's defenses. Most never make it close, as they're mowed down by drones in their thousands. As we enter 2026, Russia is discovering that manpower isn't unlimited, nor is money. A crisis of Putin's own making is upon him, and there is no way back for Russia from here. All that Russia has left is attempts at escalation without a true ending in sight. That isn't going to work either, as leaning more into a strategy that clearly isn't working is no solution to Russia's manpower crisis. Putin's end game has begun, so grab some popcorn and watch our video as we document a Russian collapse that is unfolding live in Ukraine. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more updates on the impact that Putin's attritional strategy is having on a deteriorating Russian army. And thank you for watching.